All right, how's it going, everybody? We are in week 7 of graduate school at Norwich, and this week we are focusing primarily on a relatively modern school of historical analysis. And when I say modern, we're talking late 1950s, about 1958, 1959, to 1970s, is where you can really see the genesis of the school of history. I apologize for looking like just complete shit at the moment. I went trail running today, and then I later went to do some biking and then some high intensity interval training. So hair's all fucked up. I'm really tired, and so yeah, I hope that doesn't detract from the overall uh, analysis and overview and so on and so forth. But no, the New Left really has its genesis in the sort of intermediary period directly after World War II and during the Vietnam War. And if you can summarize just in one word what really led to this sort of reinterpretation of Marxism from a minority perspective, which is primarily one of the factors that New Left history and historiography are concerned with, this sort of history from down below, or this sort of anti intellectual history and this sort of revisitation of the Marxist principles of class analysis. And one of the reasons that it became so popular, if you can just summarize it in one word, would be the Vietnam War. And the problem with Vietnam is that essentially speaking, it challenged the notion that was being put forth by consensus and nationalist school historians that, well, one, it elicited this sort of reinterpretation of America as this good entity within historical progression. And then another thing it did is that suffering already from both progressive and even prior Marxist interpretations of history, the consensus school really at its core was a byproduct of the Second World War, in which this notion of national unity and this sort of linear progression of national homogeny and this sort of American idealism really didn't undergo a lot of historical scrutiny, primarily because World War II and that period from about 41 all the way to, I would say, the mid 50s, concepts such as patriotism, national identity were relatively homogenous. So, I mean, the consensus school were on to something very clearly. But after that, it became clear that this notion that American identity and the American tradition were not a linear progress. And I think that initially speaking, the onset of the Marxist school really interpreted this and kind of shellacked the shit out of this idea. But the new left school pretty much did away with the consensus school, and that's one of the reasons, primarily, that it's so popular. There are two primary reasons. I just held up four fingers. There's two primary reasons that the new left school is as popular as it is today. One of which is that it sort of coincides with prevailing political ideology in both the field and in popular history abroad. So, in sort of sub disciplines that are more concerned with articulating history, such as journalism, and so journalism and popular history, not so much academic history, where they're concerned primarily with building a narrative and making it more approachable for a general audience. This form of historical analysis is preferred primarily because it takes an approach to history that doesn't necessarily value objectivity or this sort of very down to earth, dry format of just sticking to the evidence and using the evidence to shape your narrative. In this case, um, which is one of the front running issues of the school, but also one of the reasons that it's so attractive to such a general audience, and especially academics and journalists, is that in the narrative building process of New Left history and historiography, there is a significantly greater emphasis on the actual narrative itself rather than the evidence that constrains said narrative. Objectivity is sort of put away. It's sort of interpreted in a very Marxist view, so to speak, in as much that the facts are kind of open to interpretation, and that a fact and an objective sort of sense of evidence isn't really a thing, and that evidence is open to numerous formats of interpretation, equally valid forms of interpretation. The second aspect of the New Left historiography is honestly along the same lines as the revolutionary aspects of Marxism. So essentially speaking, and I don't mean like the inherent political ideology that's revolutionary within Marxism. I'm meaning like what the actual school of history brought to the table. So what Marxism did that made it so appealing, both then and then throughout its duration, and even including its popularity now, is that it introduced a format of historical analysis that hadn't been analyzed prior. So with Marxism, you got sort of this introduction of economics into historical analysis, and so there was a sort of consilience between two social scientific fields. And then what it also did is that it created a new meta narrative in as much that the concepts of class and the concept of class conflict became the front running sort of base by which most historical analysis could be formed. In terms of New Left history and historiography, they did a similar set of reinterpretations, in as much that historical analysis is primarily predicated on this sort of history from below. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of a devaluation of the more intellectual and scholarly and university-based history, and an emphasis on history of the people. And by people, they tend to mean individuals who have been oppressed in some way, or of minority status, gays, lesbians, transsexuals, transgenders, black, stuff along this lines. And what this did is that it sort of gave a voice to people who had been relatively voiceless in terms of especially contemporary historical analysis. And again, this kind of relates to the first point, in as much that prevailing political opinion, along with this sort of breath of fresh air in the field, really lended itself to this school's popularity. And essentially speaking, just about every popular historian that you could name or that you're familiar with in today's day and age probably belongs to the New Left School of Historical Analysis. I know I said in my last video that most historians, or maybe I didn't, there's a sort of running assertion that a lot of historians, or most if not all historians today, are Marxist, in the sense that this sort of uneasy progression and emphasis on class and class conflict is sort of the basis by which their historical narrative or their research takes focus. That's true in a sense. So what you have to understand is that the connection between Marxism and New Left history and historiography is very overt and noticeable in some aspects, and very subtle in others. And telling the difference between, per se, a very strictly Marxist historian and a very strictly New Left historian is oftentimes difficult. And a couple of very, I would say, obvious examples of this are Gabriel Kolko, Christopher Lasch, Christopher Hitchens, Paul Boyer. What is that man's name? Okay, I think I made my point. So anybody familiar with these individuals' works, they're primarily focused on three aspects, especially Lasch, especially Boyer. So most of Boyer's work, and this is Paul S. Boyer, the historian, who I do believe is still alive, most of his work is concerned primarily on political, cultural, economic, and social history. And with Boyer, class is an aspect of it, but it's sort of interwoven in a sense to where the aspects that kind of get swept under the rug in Marxism, so nationalism, racism, and so on and so forth, get included and have greater emphasis in that analysis. And I think that that's one of the distinctions, or one of the key aspects of the New Left School of History that can set it apart from the Marxist School of History, in as much that there's a degree of oversimplification as with there is in the school of Marxism, but that oversimplification is sort of allocated to a much broader scope of historical analysis, whereas in Marxism, that oversimplification is primarily allocated to the fact that the Marxist view of history sort of boils everything down to class, and class conflict. Whereas in the New Left school of history, the drive at oversimplification is primarily aimed at the fact that a lot of the things that these individuals are analyzing include a very large proportion of historical factors. So, I mean, everything from the Vietnam War. With Boyer, his one of his books that I'm more familiar with that I try and read at least once a month just to keep up my sort of background on just general American history is Promises to Keep America Since 1945, or it might be since World War II. It's a very culturally oriented book, but at the same time, aspects of Marxism are within it. But I wouldn't call it a full Marxist history. So, if that's an illustration of what New Left history is, then I think Boyer is a pretty good example. Lasch is a little bit difficult to pin down, and Kolko is definitely the same. So I mentioned Kolko in my last video as well, and he was the actual historian that I did my author article analysis on. So Kolko's whole shebang is that he saw the American system of economics as a sort of political capitalism or corporate liberalism, inasmuch that our republic had been replaced with this sort of our representative republic had sort of been replaced by corporations. And I'm not entirely certain that being a more nationalist, being a more I would consider myself sort of halfway between the nationalist and progressive school of history. I don't necessarily completely align myself with Kolko's analysis, but he makes very good points. So that's kind of his thing. So Kolko is a pretty good example of a New Left historian. Lasch, on the other hand, is a little bit difficult to sort of stake into any one particular school, because in one of his books he'll be pretty anti-conservative in nature, but then you pick up Culture of Narcissism and he just shits on everybody. I mean, he shits on liberals, he shits on conservatives, I mean, everybody. And it's from all angles too, from the cultural aspect, from the media aspect, from the nationalist aspect, from the democratic aspect, from the forms of government to policy. I mean, Jesus Christ, I mean, he was not happy with anybody in Culture of Narcissism. So I mean, that's just a very general overview of what. So okay, if I could boil New Left history down to just three main concepts that sort of define the school. First and foremost is giving a voice to the voiceless. So a primary emphasis and sort of this interconnectivity between New Left political movements. This focus on the history from down below and a sort of people's history. The second would be a rejection of the Rankian ideals of objectivity and more scholarly history, and an approach to narrative building that is very comparable to popular history or aspects of Marxist and progressive history. The third aspect that I would say sort of defines the New Left school is a sort of innate resistance to any and all aspects of the nationalist and consensus school. So if you want to summarize it in just a simple phrase, the nationalist school is the antithesis of the nationalist and consensus school of the 1940s and 50s. As of what we're doing this week, the reading was actually pretty fucking insane, if I do say so myself. I think that in total we had about 400 pages in between, because we had readings in Truman over aspects of fallacies, which sort of tied into New Left history, but the bulk of our reading was done in Historians on History, which is a book by John Tosh, or edited by John Tosh, I should say, in which certain schools of history are sort of given a voice by the representative historians who sort of comprise that school. And there was almost 200 pages in just Tosh alone, and I managed to chug through that today at work, and then I managed to get through Truman today at work. But then there are also 2 other articles for the author article analysis that we have to do, and believe it or not, one of them is over Boyer, and I do believe that the other one is over Rothgear, or I may be completely butchering his name, of which I'm pretty certain that I am, but he's another New Left historian. I'll probably end up doing the Boyer piece for my author article analysis, simply because I'm more familiar with Boyer, and I have a significantly higher degree of comfort in approaching analyzing Boyer's work, where he's coming from, what he's trying to articulate, so on and so forth, just because I did that in my undergrad with a lot of my modern American counterculture history classes. And so that'll probably be that. And then we also have a discussion post. So, I mean, kind of getting into that then. What's due this week is that we have a 750 to 1,000 word discussion post, which I posted today. It was primarily just illustrate the 3 primary concepts beholden to the New Left School of History or Historiography, and then what are the associated strengths and weaknesses with that school. My essential argument was the 3 concepts that I already went over in the video, and then the weaknesses of the school and the strengths of the school. Actually, I won't touch on that in the video. That'll probably be for another thing. If people want me to post stuff like that, I can, but I'm not really interested in doing something like that. As of right now, it's getting pretty late. So with a discussion post, and then we have an author article analysis over Boyer, and then the other historian, of which I think I'm butchering his name, or maybe I'm just reading it in entirety, which usually ends up being anywhere between the minimum's 1,000 words, but they usually end up being about 4 to 6 pages long. And then the last thing we have to do is an annotated bibliography for our historiography paper, which is right now 5 books and then 10 scholarly journal articles. So I'll probably have to completely reread. I don't think I can completely reread all of Gibbon this week. I think that maybe if I restarted volume 1, I could get just the aspect of it. So maybe get about 300 pages worth of Gibbon. And I actually don't know. So for the take it a step back, I've decided to do my paper on historiography of interpreting an more contemporary analysis of the fall of the Western Roman Empire using Brown, Perrin, Gibbon, and Burckhardt as the 4 principal sources. And then I'll probably throw in Kyle Harper's analysis of climate and cultural history, climate and disease history within the Roman Empire. I apologize. So I'll probably have to reread Harper. I know I'll have to reread aspects of Gibbon, and then I don't actually know if I have Burckhardt over on my shelf, so I might actually have to purchase that online and read it. But I think that I can get Brown and Perrin's just a very summary analysis of their books over Rome done pretty quickly. So, and then the journal articles, I'm planning on skimming those. I know that's probably not a good way of doing things in graduate school, but I would much rather, how best to describe this without sounding like a lazy fuck. I have other things that I have. Okay, so I'm going to rationalize this in a sense that I also have to sort of polish up my undergraduate work, the additional undergraduate work that I'm doing for psychology and neuroscience. My final paper is due Friday, and there are, I really just want to redo the entire discussion section. I feel like it was extremely repetitive, and after close analysis, I wasn't very happy with it, so I'll probably be redoing that. So again, I'll probably have to skim a lot of the articles that I'll be using for my historiography paper, but as long as I get sort of a good um, annotated bibliography for my books and a couple of my journal articles, which I'll probably end up reading anyways. I say I won't, but I probably will. Then I'll be fine with that. But other than that, that's week 7 at Norwich's Master of the Arts in American History, and then next week, not even gonna pretend I know what it is. We're getting close to the end of class. It's an 11-week course. The next 3 weeks are going to be pretty light in terms of content. I think this is one of the more strenuous weeks, obviously. Again, I mean, I think between everything, it'll probably be about 1,000 pages of reading, just from where I have to reread certain books, and then for the assigned readings and stuff like that. So it's pretty rough, but I mean, it's a graduate program in history, so I kind of expected that. In terms of history and neuroscience, I will be finishing those courses as of May 1st. But I think we should essentially be done. And then I don't actually start classes again for IU until June. And then starting June, I will be taking cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, graduate statistics, or graduate statistical analysis, and then a graduate level behavioral neuroscience class. So, looking forward to that. And yeah, I think that's everything. And I will see you guys later. Peace. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Please.